One day you will all be old enough to start reading fairy tales over and over again. A very good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen, and also a very good afternoon and a very good evening to the other parts of the world. Today we have a lecture on fantasy fiction world building. We all know how the elements of fantasy or how any kind of magical elements as such land us or in a way transport us to a world filled with imagination. To deliver the talk, we have invited Saif Ur Rahman Omair sir, and just to brief you all about him, Saif Ur Rahman Omair is an Indian author born and brought up in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. His schooling was done from International Indian Public School, Riyadh. Fascination for literature and fantasy fiction inspired him to work on his book called the Nucle Saga. Mr. Saif of Mukafanja College of Engineering and Technology, Hyderabad. He worked as a project manager for 5 years in a company based in Saudi Arabia. It took him about 7 years to develop the concepts of the series. The first book was published in 2012 by author Vanaja Vanagri when Saif was just 22. The second book was published in 2018, and the third and the final book is slated for release in 2021. Saif was part of Al Kalima, a writers group based in Jeddah, and is a regular participant at Nano Remo. He was a Toastmaster in District 79 and was the president of Arabian Stallions Toastmasters Club. The recipient of prestigious Tanzim Ham Hindustani Award of Excellence in Literature, Saif is an aspiring poet and a wonderful speaker as well. Sir, we are deeply honored to host you, and AIFEST is indebted to you for having accepted our invitation. We are eagerly waiting for your talk. Over to you, sir. And to my all dear participants, I just have an information for you. We will not be having any kind of live question and answer session today. Sir, it's all yours now. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Saif Rahman, and I am the author of the fantasy fiction book series, the Nucle Saga. I welcome you all to today's lecture, and I hope you all are doing well. Well, first things first, I want to express my very sincere gratitude to All India Forum for English Students, Scholars and Trainers. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity. Today I will be giving a lecture on fantasy world building, and the following lecture will be in the form of a PowerPoint presentation, as I could not simultaneously record myself and show the presentation at the same time. So without further ado, let us begin. In today's lecture cum presentation, we will be discussing one of the most crucial and critical processes when it comes to spawning your fantasy fiction world. This particular process is known as fantasy world building. I am sure that if anyone is aspiring to be a fantasy fiction writer at some point in their life, they must have come across the words called world building. And even if you have not, I earnestly hope that some concepts of this presentation may aid you in your future literary project or endeavor. In hindsight, I will be focusing mainly on a sort of general outlook or roadmap of this fascinating process, and I would rather not go in specific and other miscellaneous minute details. Therefore, we will be discussing what generally fantasy fiction is, what is its significance, and what are its different aspects and facets. And finally, but not the least, what are the key blocks or components of world building, and what kind of dilemma one potentially could come across. Foremost, let us examine what fantasy fiction is. It is a form of genre that is usually based in a fictional universe. Though fantasy has many branches, It itself belongs to a large group, a tree of fiction known as speculative fiction. Now, speculative fiction comprises of many common fictions such as science fiction, alternative history or future, horror or legendary tales, superhero stuff. Marvel movies have been dominating our box offices. I expect DC to be right around the corner as well. Sometimes a literary work or a script could be a combination of all these branches that I just mentioned. One of the main characteristics of fantasy could be, not that it should be, is that it is most often inspired by real world mythology and folklore. Example, vampires, werewolves, or witches, etc. The effect and influence on our current pop culture are huge. It has started to dominate our attention as well as our consumption of media. Case in point, how fantasy works have been portrayed and utilized in films, in television shows or series, in novels, and of course, a humongous chunk and inspiration in video games. To sum up, I like how the celebrated American author Ursula K. L. G., known most prominently for her Earthsea fantasy series, has described fantasy in her own definition. She said, and I quote, "Fantasy is the most natural language for recounting of the spiritual journey and the struggle of good and evil in the human soul." What a magnificent way to sum it, isn't it? Also, one of the other characteristics of this famed genre is that it most often uses magic or an unexplained phenomenon or a kind of supernatural concept as its main driving plot theme or element, usually something that would be deemed unusual in our world. And my observation is that the medieval setup, or what is most popularly termed as high fantasy, is the general norm of such literary works, with, of course, some notable and honorable exceptions. In addition, one of the other traits of fantasy fiction literary works is that the author does not necessarily use their narration that could be based on our history, our natural environments, our current settings of the world. What I mean to say is this type of literature has no obligation to be homogeneous with what is the present reality. Though I was a fan of science fiction, this was one of the reasons that attracted me to kickstart my writing journey. I think that's the beauty of fantasy fiction literature, that one is not bound by limitations or constraints of time or history, geopolitical factors, and physical locations. For some writers, sometimes these kinds of boundaries may sort of limit the output of their respective imagination to a very confined and restricted direction. But for some, it could be very smooth and liberating. Next, I will be discussing the significance of fantasy in our history and ancient times. When I was a student, or whenever I wanted to do some research, do a little bit of digging for my writing, for example, I always had this tendency to sort of find out the historical significance of a concept or a science and how those roots took place and paved the way for something to come to its present form. In a similar fashion, in the inception of my journey, I also wanted to know how the elements of fantasy have contributed to humankind. Did our ancestors tell each other tales of courage and beauty to inspire each other? Did mothers sing songs of legend to their children? Did these elements embed themselves to a belief? And it does not surprise me to know that fantasy fiction is a part and parcel of the very human nature. For example, if one would browse through the ancient Egyptian funerary texts, one may find the great tales of Osiris and his son Horus. I, for one, was very much interested in ancient Egyptian mythology, and thanks to the Hollywood mummy movies, but also primarily because of my read of the Alfred Hitchcock's The Mystery of the Whispering Mummy, I often daydreamed and imagined about what the life of a common Egyptian person would be, what would be their ideals and beliefs. This is where Osiris comes in, where he had a brother called Seth who later assassinates him. Osiris is later resurrected by one of his sisters but cannot rule the lands anymore, so in turn happens to rule the world of the undead. His son Horus becomes the ruler of the realm of men. For the typical Egyptian folk, Osiris was seen as a kind of a role model. They tried to emulate his example so that they could earn immortality. Now, who would have thought that thousands of years ago the Egyptians believed in resurrection, redemption, and immortality? This is all exceptionally fascinating for me and were perhaps causative for me to take up writing and reading more literature. I am just taking the liberty to share tidbits of my journey and why I dived into the waters of fantasy fiction literature. Indeed, in discussing the history of fantasy works, we cannot allow ourselves to forget Beowulf, a heroic tale loosely based on Norse mythology but exceptionally popular in Old English. I remember that many years ago, an animated movie was released and a lot of people flocked to the theaters to watch it, including myself, not only because of the beautiful and splendid animation, but also perhaps to assess how the animators could capture the essence of that work and retell the story of Beowulf. One of the other examples of fantasy fiction literature is famously known as Arabian Nights, alternatively called as 1001 Nights, a myriad collection of Middle Eastern tales, but its stories can also be traced back to ancient medieval Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and yes, even Indian literature. And yet again, as a small child, I used to enthusiastically read a lot of such books and other compilations. They essentially catapulted my thoughts, and as I read them, they planted the seeds of imagination in my mind to grow deep within my own consciousness. Many of the story characters have become cultural icons in themselves. If I'm not mistaken, the movie Aladdin was released by Disney in 2019. Today's children grow up to the tales of Sinbad and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. A notable mention here is the famed ancient Indian collection of interrelated animal fables called the Panchatantra. When we come to modern fantasy, today's many classics undisputedly have elements of fantasy in them. For instance, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz or Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Even in classical works such as Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol have these themes and elements. Inevitably, such type of books are clearly a favorite among youngsters. One of the best examples that I can give today to all of you is the world phenomenal success of the Harry Potter book series. I mean, I have never come across a voracious reader who has not read Harry Potter. Maybe some of you have, but I certainly have not. In our modern times, fantasy works have pretty much captured and dominated most of the imagination of the author and the reader alike. One of the most well-known works is obviously The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, which enjoys a cult-like following throughout the globe. Its movies are associated with brilliant filmmaking, and the movies are the recipient of many Oscars and other awards. I personally consider J.R.R. Tolkien to arguably be the father of modern medieval type of high fantasy fiction literature. Game of Thrones is incredibly famous and has a tremendous impact on our pop culture. There's no doubt about it. The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini is exemplary and is an honorable mention here in this list as well. Very recently, the Witcher saga is also sort of gaining steam through their games are critically acclaimed since a long time ago. The books themselves are praised and well known. In fact, there's a season 1 of this saga on Netflix. So, all I can say is that the impact of fantasy is not going to end in the foreseeable future. So, the real question for today is what exactly is world building? It is a process where writers create a kind of real, sometimes even hyper realistic, living, breathing environment and a setting for their respective stories. So, in a nutshell, you are sort of creating an in depth sketch for the background of your story. Today, I will be sharing these processes from my own experiences and undertakings, purely because you all may benefit from it and have an inside perspective and idea for your works to move forward to mature out, if you so wish to commit, of course. Contrary to the popular view, the process is not definitive in nature. It is rather more relative in nature. When it comes to world building, there are two pathways or schools of thought to this process. One is the spontaneous method, the other is the planned method. So, what I mean by spontaneous method is when you write your plot or narration, you procreate your fictitious world parallelly. As you progress, both your plot as well as the world matures at the same exact time. So it is like crossing a particular bridge as you approach it and not overthink about it beforehand. The criticism for this method is that your literary work is prone to plot holes and various other errors in the long run. The other method is that once you have decided to create a world, you dedicate a great deal of your personal time before chalking out the plot. Some authors go the extreme route and completely design and plan each and every aspect of the world, baby. The objection to this method is that it is extremely time and patience consuming. Like I'm talking about at least months, if not years. My own very personal opinion is that I believe there's a sweet spot between these two methodologies, and that is 70% of your world could be planned in advance, and 30% of it could be spontaneous. This is because some elements or characters must be spontaneous because it gives that free room, that extra space for your characters to have more depth and to respond more naturally to certain situations, circumstances, or environments. That sort of freedom to improvise should be given to your literary work so that character arcs are not just one dimensional but also have the effortless ability to develop and evolve accordingly. Therefore, my advice 70% plan, 30% spontaneous. So, before we dive into the fundamental blocks of world building, we must understand that fictitious worlds can be classified into two broad categories. Let us discuss the differences. First world means that this type of world is grounded to our very own and shares universally everything or at least most of it. They borrow heavily from our present as well as past. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code or Angels and Demons is an example that we can consider. But remember that ultimately, at the end of the day, they are just works of fiction. Now, if something is considered to be a second world literary work, what it basically means is that such literature has many things common to our own world's physical laws and nature, but there are other factors that are variables, like tribes, sentient beings, nations, history, or culture. We can establish a sense of belonging with them, but not immersely accept them as part of our reality. Game of Thrones map of Westeros can be a good example for a second world literary work. An interesting fact is that J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, had an opinion that all works of fiction are second world. Now, the problem with this is that there are no globally accepted explicit scientific definitions for these types of worlds. A lot of gray area between these two types of worlds. For example, where would you classify the Harry Potter universe? Most would agree to put it in the first world, for it happens parallelly with our world history, but the visiting world is hidden in plain sight. So, what about the map of Hogwarts, for example? And it opens a can of worms, to be honest. But let us all stick to the very basic definition. If it is in our times, which is past or present, then it is a first world. No questions asked. All else, push it to the second world category. Simple and easy. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, let us now discuss the primary blocks, the foundations of word building. And there are three. First is the magic system, second is the map that you might be creating or you might not be creating, and then finally, what kind of a setting that you are going to give to your world. Now, why I have included magic system at the top is because uh, either it could be a magical phenomena that is predominant in your work, or it could be a supernatural element, or it could be an unexplained phenomena. But when it is a work of fantasy, you will have this kind of element. Certainly, otherwise, it comes in a different genre. Now, when it comes to maps, you need to work on the geographical features. You need to discuss how you're going to deal with the time and distance kind of a problem. And in the geographical features itself, what are going to be the features, the physical features of land and the sea, what's going to be the flora and fauna, what kind of vegetation is going to exist throughout your map, what kind of animals are situated at different points, what are the different sentient beings that inhabit your world, and are there any very exclusive magical creatures that are part of your world? And these are the types of questions you need to address before you can proceed further. And of course, you can also give more depth to your world by customizing the weather patterns and climate. And you will have to be, as you're going through your plot, is it day, is it night, or is it just going to be a time where there are no days, it's just a long night, and whether there are two moons or one moon or two suns, and these kinds of fundamental questions you need to ask yourself before you start your work. Now, one of the most important blocks of word building is what kind of a setting are you going to give. So you need to decide on what the history is going to be of a particular region or of your world in general. What kind of a political system exists right now as the plot progresses, and what is the culture that is present throughout your world? What is the language that people have? What kind of dress they wear? Do they have any kinds of religious beliefs? And finally, we also need to discuss what kind of weaponry exists, and what is the level, the extent of technology that's present, and what is the transportation, and what is the commerce, the livelihood of people. And these are the questions you need to ask yourself before you proceed any further. Since the concept of fantasy is based primarily on magic phenomena, that can be a good place to start your work. There are a series of questions that you can ask yourself. For example, what is the phenomena of magic or any unexplained element? Is it energy or light or something like that? Will you be explaining the origins of such elements? That's why, do they exist in the first place? Are they concentrated at certain places like mountains, or are universally present everywhere? Are they going to be laws for your magic? If so, will there be any exceptions? Do they go hand in hand with the physical laws of your world or supersede them? Or would you like to leave everything open to interpretation for the reader, food for their thoughts? Regardless of which approach you take to with regards to word building, I am certain that once you have the answers to these questions, you will have a pretty good idea of your upcoming world and its subsequent development. Now, some might argue saying that why would you need a physical map? You don't need a map. But as a writer, if you do end up developing a map, you can have a distinct advantage to have a good sense of your world. Now, will you share that map with the reader or not? Well, that is completely your choice. You can share it or use it purely for your own reference. It really depends on what kind of a world are you engaging in. If it is a first world literary work, then perhaps you or the reader might not exactly require a map. But if it is a second world literary, I would strongly recommend you to develop one, at least for yourself, because they really give you that sense of space, distance, and period. They aid you in visualizing the world that you are investing and building. They don't necessarily have to be complicated schematics, just a white piece of paper, a pencil with a dash of imagination, and you are good to go. A small recap for developing your map: you might have to work on the land and see geographical features, the weather and climate dynamics, the distribution of flora and fauna, the locations of any other magical creatures or sentient beings, and what units of time and distance are you going to assign. The task of developing the features of a physical map can be intimidating and overwhelming process, especially when it comes to the geography. You have to decide what to incorporate into your world. Example: mountains, rivers, seas, marshes, lakes, forests, deserts. To make this task easier, I would suggest to all of you to get yourself a traditional good old-fashioned atlas. You can get it in from your local library. There are many available online for free, or you can visit your stationery shop and invest in one. A thorough reading, if not study, will give you a fairly good idea of how you want to proceed. Then you can get to decide what features you would like to put and what you wouldn't want to put in your particular world. So, for all of your reference, I present to you all the map of Middle-earth from J.R.R. Tolkien's literary magnum opus. It is an exceptionally amazing and beautiful map filled with so many features such as various types of geography, cities, and other places with borders. Any Lord of the Rings fan certainly will be well versed with this awesome map. In today's talk, I will also share a little bit of my own work so that you all may get to understand the development process, and you can in some way actually correlate with what I'm talking about. Alright, so here's a tangent discussing a little about my own journey in world building. As I wrote the first chapters, it was a confusing mess for me. That's when I started to actively participate in the process. With the help of my beloved and sweet sister, we decided to have three main continents, around 8 to 10 kingdoms and other uncharted territories. I must admit it was an exciting process. Over the months, we developed ports, cities, and also named them. We were kids, so random names was the way forward for us. The villages, towns were also put on paper, but not on a map as of yet. Just what the kingdoms are and what are their capitals going to be. As of present time, the trilogy has 33 places with at least 14 cities. I later decided to name my map the Nucleus, but then we had to develop the map for the visualization part. So the task was set to create the boundaries and give some geographical features. So therefore, let us see how my map transformed and evolved over time to reach its present and final form. As you can see on your screen, this attempt of a map was done on Microsoft Paint that was designed approximately 14 to 13 years ago. So I request you all to not judge me so harshly. We were small kids at that time. The first activities included drawing land masses, the borders, and dividing the sea. Then we worked our way up to fill in some colors and add some geographical features such as where would the rivers be, the mountains, the arid dry regions, or the icy ones. Again, this is a bare bone basic map in evolution that still did not have the locations of the kingdoms or cities. We finally tried to incorporate our kingdoms in the map. At this point, I had not even named my map. This map merely had the kingdoms and a few places, but it was more than enough for me to start work on my literary project. As now I clearly had a sense of where things are going to take place and how anything may happen. As I said before, my approach was roughly around 70% plan and 30% spontaneous. In the end, this was our amateur take on this map with complete features and minor changes. It had distinct geographical features such as forest cover, mountains, desert, valley, all cities, villages, and towns, the borders and kingdom places. Even ports were designated along the coastlines. I have to admit that this map was so large, around 20 MB, that it sometimes crashed our systems before 2010. This map was completed roughly around the same period, 2 years before the publication of my first book in 2012. With this, I had completed a place for my characters to belong to. This map is unique as it belongs to my publishing period in the year 2012. This was the take of the professional illustrator assigned by Virtual Reality Publications. He had gone for a more parchment kind of a feel and texture. There are a lot of omissions compared to the previous map, as a counter-argument was presented that perhaps the map could be complicated for the readers as well as it could present a logistical challenge to print it in one portion. So this evolution took place in roughly 7 years, but this is not the end of it. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the final form of my map, and I present to you the nucleus. It has all the geographical features, the powers, and the places. It is a compilation of every single detail, and naturally, it looks much better than the previous iterations. What I would like to add at this point is that your map is not going to be developed overnight. It's going to take a lot of your personal time and self-investment. I personally feel that this is just like a process where you are taking care of your baby or your child, where you have to provide constant care and nourishment. This is the same case with the map of a literary world if you choose to design it. One of the greatest challenges and conundrums that boggled my mind was how to deal with the time and distance expressions in the inception of my writing journey in fantasy fiction. Now, in our times, if there is a meeting, say at 9 o'clock am, you merely say 9 o'clock am, plain and simple. This expression of time is pretty much understood at the receiving end. Now, the question, how do you say 9 o'clock p.m., for example, in your literature? For surely they do not use clocks in our world, do they? So naturally, I was very confused with the expression problem, but I did a little digging and I read other authors' works as well. To my great relief, I found out that there is no hard and fast rule when it comes to leading with the expressions of time and distance, respectively. It really is not a big deal. For example, you could say there is a village 25 miles or kilometers away from the coastline. That is 100% okay. The reason is because that even though if your worlds are not Earth-like, the prose, the words of the literature, I mean the text that you see on the pages itself is considered or implied that it is a work of translation. So why not translate the time and distance unit expressions that we are familiar with? In a nutshell, what I am saying is that the expression of time and distance should not be an issue, as there is no hard and fast rule. It really is your choice, and no one is going to mock or question you about it. In my particular case, I did not use an expression such as 9 o'clock. Rather, I used to describe the time which was relative to the sun setting. For instance, whenever it was daytime or night or sunset or dawn, there were these close enough approximations. And for distance, I use expressions like a day's walk or a half a day's walk. So it's completely your choice, and this is a matter that shouldn't be a problematic issue. So now I will discuss the different kind of settings of background that you can provide for your fictitious world. They are basically three types: utopian, dystopian, and pseudo-utopian. So what utopian means that it is an ideal, heavenly, nearly paradise-like setup where everything is perfect and flawless. In literature out there, I have myself rarely come across such worlds. There was this one work where the world was truly utopian, but the friction of the lead character's thoughts and ideas paved the way for a hell-like experience. It's pretty depressing. Next comes the dystopian, which is the opposite of what utopia means. A dystopia is a sort of a setup that is frightening and challenging. They are often characterized by dehumanization, tyrannical governments, environmental disasters, or a general decline in the social fabric or structure. But this type of setup is very common in the literary world. It creates an intriguing and spectacular frictional dynamics between the world and the protagonists. There are also popular works where the world is utopian, but over a period of time descends back into dystopia. The third category is actually the second one, but in disguise. The world appears perfect, but as you read along the plot, you realize that what appears is not truly the case, and it is all deceiving in nature. There is this level of sinisterness to all the details that eventually betray the setup to be a true dystopia disguised as utopia. And that's what I like to call pseudo utopia. Again, it really depends on what kind of a setup you would like to go for. Always remember, the first rule of fantasy fiction world building is that there are no rules. It is paramount that you must understand this. There are no specific guidelines, rule book, or laws that you have to abide by. This is the beauty of fantasy fiction. It could be anything, it could be everything or nothing, it could be a worldless world, for example. It all depends on you. It is completely your choice how you want to design something, how you want to present a work of fiction. There are no boundaries that stop you. The possibilities are virtually limitless. And maybe that is why many fantasy fiction writers enjoy working in this genre for this very particular reason. Here in this slide, more details and blogs about the background with regards to your setting. And these questions: what is the history of the regions? What is the kind of political system that exists? What are the various cultures? What are the religious beliefs? How about the technology and the transportation? What I'm trying to present here is what I believe to be a streamlined and ideal roadmap, but certainly not mandatory for you. If you engage in word building for any of these blocks, you can certainly choose to skip. The process that I am describing aims to bring a level of consistency and finesse to your literary project, and also to provide the likelihood of avoiding plot holes or contradictions in your literature. Visualizing and thinking about these components will help you in creating a multi-dimensional universe. We'll go a little more in details in depth for these components for today's lecture come presentation. So I hope you all are still with me. If you decide on creating history or multiple histories, here are some questions yet again that you can address. So, how did a place come to be? How did the leadership evolve to its present form? What were those factors? Who were the previous leaders and who are the current ones? Is there any power struggle around a particular region? Is it ambition that drives that wedge or natural resources? Why are the prevailing conditions so? I mean, if there was a war a long time ago, that explains the dwindling population. So, factors like that. So, here yet again, I am showing you a glimpse of my own work. For example, there were four ages in my book, and this is one such diagram. Though I have a more elaborate and extensive document, these short timeline summary diagrams allow me to have a sense of what happened at what point. So this could serve as a tip for all of you, summarizing history into short timelines for quick reference. In my case, I pin it while I write so that I don't end up with any mistakes, and if any of my characters are referring to say a point in history, I can have a very quick glance. Coming quickly to the political system, and what I mean by here is what is every region's political system? Is it anarchy, like a state of lawlessness with no rulership? Is it a form of monarch or kingdom? Is ruling done by the people, as in like a democracy? Is it ruled by a couple of leaders, or is it a junta, as in a military coup? You can develop these concepts alongside history, and it will really help you to give depth to your fictitious world. If you establish it in the earlier stages, it will help you down the line. Back to my work, wherein my world there are kingdoms present universally. So while designing the map, I wrote down the names of the kingdoms, what would their flags appear like, what do the flags themselves represent, what is the status of these kingdoms, and in sense, are these nations in war or in alliance? As I said before, I maintained a document that has extensive and elaborate details written about each place shown here. I hope by seeing such examples from my archives, you all come to understand the world building process. One of the greatest challenges for me was definitely the conundrum of language, and this could potentially be an issue. For this developmental stage, some vital questions are as follows. Is there going to be a universal language in your book, a language that is spoken by all people? Or are you going to develop a special or a regional specific language? And if you do intend to develop a different special language, are you going to visit the language department at your educational institute and sit with a linguistic expert? Or is it too extreme for you? Can you randomize the names? And why yes, of course you can remember the only rule of fantasy fiction. And what about the nomenclature and naming? Could it be a little more complex? Can we use real world common names such as Tom or Sam? And the answer is yes, definitely. No one is going to question or mock you. It is completely your choice. You are captain of that particular ship. A truly fundamental and overlooked aspect, a couple of questions ought to do the trick. For example, is religious belief dominating factor in your literary work in sense not for you as a writer, but as for the people that inhabit your world? Can we just skip this entire thing? But then you have to ask yourself, what really drives the moral compass, the moral principles of your protagonists and antagonists alike? In my particular case, since my map was wide, I created around 11 religious beliefs for my fantasy world. Of course, no character admits that openly and say, hey, I'm a follower of so and so, but rather it's implied. For instance, if there is a conversation between two or more characters, then it can be understood. I went the extra mile because I wanted a little more depth and character to my world itself. The concept of dressing comes under the domain of culture, and it can be done at the very last stage of your world building. This is because once you have developed the history, the geographical locations, the concept of language, it becomes far much easier for you to work on what kind of attire someone is wearing. It is comparatively easy because, for example, if they are situated in, say, a hot climate, naturally they would be wearing something that is loose and light, kind of a fabric like cotton. And if it is a chilly place, then obviously they would be wearing clothes which are thick. So it really depends on many factors such as what is the climate, what type of a region it is, what is their history and their belief systems, and all those factors can help you in determine what kind of a clothing you want to assign for the masses in general and as well as for your characters. Finally, but not the least, what is the level of technology that is there in your world? It's a fundamental question. Because of that technology, what is the type of weaponry that exists? Does the phenomenon of magic aid this weaponry or technology, or does it render it useless? For instance, if there is a sorcerer on the battlefield, will shooting at him or her, or aiming arrows at that particular person is going to be simply useless? Or does technology go hand in hand with magic itself? Is this very sorcerer supercharging their weapons with magic and attacking? So, what is the general livelihood of people, and how do people travel? Do they travel by ships or chariots or cars? Do they ride horses? So, by answering all these kinds of questions, it opens the door for formulating your fictitious world in the best possible way. Ladies and gentlemen, before I wind up, I would also like to discuss about the opposition to world building and fantasy fiction itself. There is undoubtedly a healthy level of criticism when it comes to this genre set. The most common that I have come across is that some critics say that fantasy fiction is exceptionally childish in nature. It is designed to target only uh, a small subset of readers, and yet it does not, as they claim, cater to the developing mind. Another strong criticism that I have gotten to know is that contemporary fantasy fiction is a kind of male perspective, which is actually true. Example, The Hobbit or Peter Pan, and thus it does not do justice to the treatment of women. And that is the reason why I invite and encourage to have more female writers who would engage in fantasy fiction literary works and sort of straighten out the offset balance of the male dominance in fantasy. That would be incredible. That would be amazing. Not just female writers, no, but male writers too must strive to bring female characters in the forefront and give them a more central role rather than secondary characters. So, together we all can collectively uh, change this contemporary norm of fantasy, that is the male perspective. Also, we must all realize that fantasy fiction is usually open to interpretation for the reader and the author alike. This sort of interpretation can go any direction. I feel it is so important for me to stress on the fact that today's presentation was more of a roadmap rather than a framework or a guide. And perhaps it's true that today's content may or may not help you, but I sincerely hope that it has been insightful for all of you. The reason why must aspiring fantasy fiction writers engage in concrete and solid world building so that it can aid them and help them in developing a world that is consistent in nature and above all believable. Something that a reader can escape and seek refuge in. Fantasy fiction can be traced back to ancient literature on human affairs, stories of tragedies and redemption, ancient power struggles and the present power struggles. This is the property of fantasy fiction, that it has this ability to present as well as transcend time. And there is this certain joy or jubilance where you pour yourself into a book and create this intricate levels of complexity where you are converting your imagination into something that can be shared with the entire world out there. And fantasy fiction is, in my very humble opinion, it's a kind of an art. For example, if you go to, say, a museum, and if you look at the statue or a piece of art or painting, for example, the artist's intention and interpretation and portrayal is different, and what you see is different, and the person beside you interprets it differently. Thus, such types of works are very subjective in nature, and thus they are not objective. Similarly, fantasy fiction is also very subjective in nature, as when the reader reads through such works, they draw in from their own individual experiences and try to imagine what a writer is possibly trying to convey or portray. Our primary reason for engaging in fantasy fiction works is it's to spin a beautiful, captivating, and heart-touching story. And I even dare say, even make you uncomfortable, make you ponder the questions in your life. So, at the end of the day, aren't we ourselves nothing but stories? A brief spot of in the fabric of space and time. Fantasy fiction world building, ladies and gentlemen, is an incredible process. Certainly, it's not easy, and I can say that from my own experience. Like, I've been working on my books for about 15 years, and yet still it's such a beautiful process where you engage yourself in creating something so realistic, and this experience, this heightened sense of clarity and reality that you're intervening. It's sort of like, how can I say this, exploring as well as engineering a world which is exclusively designed by you, that is truly your own. It's truly unique and something exactly the way how you want it to be. The fact of the matter is, every single human being, every single one of us, except for someone who is perhaps impaired or in a vegetative state, every single human being is not just capable but also proactively they engage in world building. How, you might ask? Well, don't every single one of us have dreams and aspirations, which we tend to visualize and fantasize about our goals and objectives? Does not our uh, objectives push us forward? So, one might argue and say some people like to go with the flow. To them, I say that our minds are so complexly created in such a way where it has this internal innate desire to engage, at least passively, in world building in the form of dreams. We do it every single night and we don't even realize that. So all I tend to say is that it's not rocket science. With that, I wish to conclude my very humble presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, as all great things must come to an end, so must this beautiful opportunity of mine to share a tiny bit of experience and a little bit of knowledge with all of you on this day. It has been my distinct pleasure and honor to be with all of you. So take care, wish you all a pleasant day, and best of luck.